The diesel bill came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days I drove into town for feed, and the post office was right next door, and I always told myself I wouldn't check the mailbox until I was done loading the truck. But I always checked. And that Tuesday in late March, standing in the gravel lot with my boots still dusty from the morning's work, I tore open the envelope from the fuel co-op and felt the air leave my chest. $4,812. 1 month of diesel. 1 month of keeping the old Case IH running across 600 acres of soybeans and corn that, if the market held, and it never held, might net me enough to do it all over again come fall. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 46 years old. I've been farming this land since I was 22, when my father handed me the keys to the equipment shed, shook my hand like I was a business partner and not his only son, and said, "It's yours now. Don't let it beat you." 24 years later, standing in that gravel lot with a fuel bill that could have bought a decent used car, I wasn't sure I'd kept my end of the deal. The thing about farming in central Illinois is that nobody tells you when you've lost. There's no final whistle, no buzzer. You just keep planting and harvesting and planting again, and every year the margins get thinner, and every year the seed companies raise their prices, and every year the elevators pay a little less per bushel, and one morning you wake up and realize you've been losing for a decade, but you're too tired to notice. That's where I was. 600 acres. A mortgage that felt like a noose. Equipment that was held together with baling wire and stubbornness. And a wife, Karen, who hadn't said, "Maybe we should sell," out loud yet, but I could hear it in the silence between us at dinner, in the way she looked at the bank statements on the kitchen table, in the way she stopped talking about next year. The big farms around me, the Hendersons, the Pulaskis, the corporate outfit that had bought out the Dawson place, they were all getting bigger, buying more land, running GPS-guided combines that cost more than my house. They had margins I couldn't touch because they had scale I couldn't reach. Every year they expanded, and every year I watched the gap between their world and mine grow wider, like a crack in dry earth that starts thin and ends up swallowing everything. I used to think if I just worked harder I could keep up. I'd be out before dawn and back after dark. My hands were cracked and stained and my back ached in places I didn't know backs could ache. But hard work doesn't beat math. And the math was simple. At $4.80 a gallon, with corn at $3.70 a bushel and input costs climbing every season, I was spending more to grow the crop than the crop was worth. My father would have called that a fool's errand, and he would have been right. It was Karen who first mentioned the patch of land behind the barn. We were sitting on the porch one evening in early April, the kind of evening where the sky turns the color of a bruised peach and the air smells like wet soil and something green just starting to push through. She had a glass of lemonade in her hand. She always made lemonade when she had something to say. And she nodded toward the back of the property without looking at me. "What about that acre back there?" she said. "The one your mother used to garden." I followed her gaze. Behind the old red barn, past the rusted disc harrow that hadn't moved in 3 years, there was a flat stretch of ground about 1.5 acres, maybe 2. My mother had kept a garden there when I was a boy. Tomatoes, peppers, green beans, sweet corn. She'd sell the overflow at the church on Sundays. People used to say, Margaret Miller's tomatoes tasted like summer itself. After she passed, the patch went to weeds. That was 11 years ago. Now it was a tangle of ragweed and volunteer corn, and a few stubborn raspberry bushes that refused to die. "What about it?" I said. You could grow something there, something you could sell yourself. Not through the elevator, not through a middleman. Just you and the customer. I almost laughed. I was a row crop farmer. I drove a tractor. I planted 1,000 acres of soybeans by GPS coordinates. I didn't sell tomatoes from a card table. "Ethan," she said, and her voice was soft in a way that made my throat tighten. "We can't keep doing what we're doing. You know that." I did know that. I just hadn't been ready to say it. The next morning, I walked out to the patch behind the barn for the first time in years. It was early, barely past 6, and the dew was still heavy on the weeds. My boots left dark prints in the grass. A meadowlark was singing from the fence post at the edge of the property, that liquid 3-note call that always made me think of my mother, standing in this exact spot with a hoe in her hand and dirt on her knees. The soil was dark, rich. It had been resting for over a decade, untouched by chemicals, unfatigued by monoculture. I bent down and grabbed a fistful and squeezed it. It held together, then crumbled when I opened my fingers. Perfect tilth. The kind of soil my mother would have called ready. Something shifted in my chest. Not hope exactly. More like the memory of hope, the faint echo of a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in a long time. I went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pencil. Not a laptop, not a spreadsheet, just paper and lead, the way my father used to plan. And I started making a list. Heirloom tomatoes, Cherokee Purples, Brandywines, Sun Golds, sweet peppers, jalapenos, Kentucky Wonder Beans, Silver Queen sweet corn, cucumbers, zucchini, basil, because my mother always said basil and tomatoes were married, and you couldn't separate them. Karen came in and looked over my shoulder and didn't say anything. She just put her hand on the back of my neck, and it was warm, and I kept writing. I spent 2 weeks clearing that patch by hand. No tractor, no machinery, just a shovel, a rake, and a pair of leather gloves that wore through by the 3rd day. I pulled ragweed until my shoulders burned. I turned the soil with a broad fork I borrowed from old Henry Talbot down the road, who hadn't farmed in 10 years, but still kept every tool he'd ever owned in a shed behind his house, oiled and sharpened and ready. "Market garden?" Henry said when I told him what I was doing. He was 81, thin as a fence rail, with hands like knotted rope. "Your mama would approve." "Most people think I'm crazy," I said. Henry looked at me for a long moment. "Most people don't grow their own food anymore. That don't make them smart." There were mornings when I'd stop and lean on the shovel and just breathe. The smell of that soil, dark, mineral, alive, took me back 30 years in an instant. I could see my mother kneeling right here, her straw hat tilted to one side, her fingers pressing tomato seedlings into the ground with a gentleness that always surprised me. She'd hum while she worked, old hymns mostly, songs I didn't know the names of but could still hear in my head if I closed my eyes. She never rushed. She never checked a clock. She'd say, "The garden tells you when it's done, not the other way around." I didn't understand that until now. One afternoon, while digging near the fence line, my shovel hit something metallic. I knelt down and brushed the dirt away and pulled out a small hand trowel, rusted at the blade, the wooden handle worn smooth by years of grip. My mother's trowel. She must have left it in the ground the last time she worked this patch, 11 years ago, and the earth had just held on to it. I cleaned it off and set it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink where it caught the morning light, and I didn't tell Karen why. My eyes were red when she came downstairs. I built raised beds from lumber I salvaged from the old chicken coop my father had built in the 80s. The wood was weathered gray on the outside but still solid underneath. Good cedar, the kind they don't sell at the hardware store anymore. I ran drip irrigation from the well behind the barn. I started seeds in trays on the south-facing windowsill of the kitchen, where the morning sun came in strong and warm, and Karen and I watched the first green sprouts push through the soil mix like tiny fists reaching for the light. The neighbors noticed. Of course they did. In a farming community, everybody knows everybody's business, and when Ethan Miller stopped running his planter across the North 40 and started hauling compost to a patch behind his barn, people talked. "Heard Miller's growing vegetables now," I overheard at the co-op. The voice belonged to Dale Henderson, whose family farmed 3,000 acres and had just bought a new John Deere S78. Oh, combine that cost more than some houses in town. Tomatoes and peppers. Like a hobby gardener. There was laughter. Quiet, polite Midwestern laughter, the kind that isn't mean on the surface but cuts deep underneath. I didn't say anything. I loaded my feed and drove home and kept working. By late May, the garden was planted. 12 rows of tomatoes, staked and tied with strips of old cotton sheet. 4 rows of peppers, 2 rows of beans climbing up twine I'd strung between posts, a block of sweet corn along the west edge where it would catch the afternoon sun, cucumbers and zucchini in mounds, basil and cilantro and dill tucked into every gap. It was small, laughably small compared to the 600 acres of row crops I was still trying to manage. But when I stood at the edge of that garden in the early morning, with the dew shining on the leaves and the smell of warm earth rising around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like I was actually growing something, not just managing inputs and outputs and spreadsheets and debt. Growing, the way farming was supposed to feel before it became an industrial equation. I built the roadside stand on a Saturday in June. It wasn't much. A wooden frame with a plywood counter and a corrugated tin roof, set back from the county road at the edge of our property. I painted a sign by hand, Miller Farm, fresh produce. Karen wanted me to add prices, but I said we'd figure that out when we had something to sell. "If we have something to sell," she said, but she was smiling. The first week of July, the tomatoes started coming in. Cherokee Purples the size of softballs, their shoulders dark and cracked with flavor. Brandywines that were ugly as sin and tasted like nothing you'd ever bought in a grocery store. Sungolds that burst in your mouth like tiny drops of sunshine. I set up the stand on a Thursday morning with 6 baskets of tomatoes, a few bags of beans, and some jalapenos. I put out a hand-lettered price list and a metal cash box and sat in a folding chair under the tin roof and waited. The first car that stopped was driven by a woman I didn't recognize. Not local, maybe from one of the towns along the interstate. She picked up a Cherokee Purple and turned it in her hand and looked at me. "You grow these?" "Yes, ma'am." "They're beautiful." She bought 4 pounds, paid cash, drove away. The next car didn't stop for 2 hours. But I sat there. I had nowhere else to be. By the end of that first day, I'd sold $32 worth of tomatoes and beans. It was nothing. A rounding error compared to what I needed. But I drove back to the house with the cash box on the seat beside me, and I felt lighter than I had in months. Then the storm came. It was the 3rd week of July. The weather had been hot and dry, good for my garden, which I was watering by hand and with the drip lines. But the big row crop operations were starting to worry. Corn needs rain in July. Soybeans need rain in July. And it wasn't coming. And then it came all at once. I was in the kitchen when I heard the sky split open. Not thunder. Something bigger, deeper, like the earth itself was being torn. I went to the window and watched the wall of green-black cloud roll in from the west like a curtain being drawn across the world. The wind hit first, bending the trees sideways, sending a sheet of dust across the yard. Then the hail. I've been through hailstorms before. Every farmer has. But this one was different. The stones were the size of marbles, then golf balls, then something bigger, crashing against the barn roof like a drum, punching holes in the aluminum siding of the equipment shed, shredding the leaves of the maple tree in the front yard like confetti. It lasted 11 minutes. I know because I stood at the window and counted every second, gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. When it stopped, the silence was louder than the storm. I pulled on my boots and walked outside. The yard was covered in ice. The big fields, my corn, my soybeans, the crops that were supposed to pay the mortgage, were flattened. 600 acres of row crops, beaten into the mud like they'd been rolled over by a giant hand. The corn stalks were snapped at the base. The soybean plants were stripped bare. My chest tightened. My vision blurred. I stood there in the middle of the devastation and felt the ground tilt under my feet. Then I looked toward the barn. The old red barn had taken the storm head-on. Its broadside, facing west, had caught the worst of the wind. But behind it, sheltered in its shadow like a child behind its mother, the garden was still standing. The barn had blocked the hail. The raised beds, tucked close to the back wall, had been protected by the overhang of the roof. A few tomato cages were bent. Some bean poles had shifted, but the plants were intact. The tomatoes were still on the vine, fat and red and unbroken. I sank to my knees in the wet grass and pressed my hands against my face and stayed there for a long time. The storm didn't just hit my farm. It carved a path 40 miles wide through the heart of the county. The Henderson operation lost 800 acres of corn. The Pulaski's soybeans were gone. The corporate outfit on the old Dawson place filed an insurance claim that would take months to process. 3 counties were declared disaster areas before the weekend was over, and the grocery stores felt it almost immediately. Within 10 days, the produce shelves in the nearest towns started looking thin. Prices climbed. Tomatoes that had been $2 a pound were suddenly $4. Sweet corn doubled. The big commercial growers who supplied the regional chains had taken the same hit everyone else had. And the pipeline that kept the stores stocked with fresh vegetables, a pipeline most people never thought about until it broke, was suddenly dry. I didn't plan what happened next. I want to be clear about that. I didn't sit in my kitchen with a calculator and think, now's my chance. I was grieving the loss of 600 acres of row crops, same as everyone else. My insurance would cover some of it, but not all, and not fast. But the garden was still producing. The tomatoes didn't know there had been a disaster. The peppers didn't care about commodity prices. The beans kept climbing. The corn kept tasseling. And every morning, I walked out behind the barn and picked what was ripe and loaded it into crates and drove it to the stand. The first Monday after the storm, I set up the stand at 7 in the morning, same as usual. By 7:30, there was a line. Not a long line. 6 people, maybe 7. But I'd never had a line before. They were from Greenville, 12 miles east. They'd heard, from a friend, from a neighbor, from someone who'd stopped at the stand the week before, that there was a farmer on County Road 14 who had fresh tomatoes. I sold everything I had by 9 o'clock. Every tomato, every pepper, every bag of beans. A woman in a minivan asked if I had sweet corn, and I said it wasn't quite ready yet, and she said, "I'll come back." She came back. They all came back. By late July, I was harvesting more than the stand could hold. I started bringing crates of tomatoes to the parking lot of the Baptist church in Greenville on Wednesday evenings, where the pastor let me set up a folding table next to the community bulletin board. I sold out in 40 minutes the first time. The second time, people were waiting when I arrived. A woman named Ruth. She must have been 70, with silver hair pulled back in a braid and hands that looked like they'd done their share of gardening, came up to the table and held a Brandywine to her nose and closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "My mother grew these," she said, "in Kentucky 50 years ago. I haven't tasted one since. She bought a whole flat. She came back every Wednesday for the rest of the summer. That's the thing nobody tells you about growing food this way. It's not just calories and nutrients and supply chains. It's memory. It's identity. Every tomato carries the ghost of every tomato that came before it, and when someone bites into a Brandywine that tastes the way a Brandywine is supposed to taste, they're not just eating, they're remembering. They're going home to a place that might not exist anymore except in the flavor of a piece of fruit that somebody grew with their own hands in their own dirt." I understood that now. My mother had always understood it. I was just slow to catch on. Word spread the way it does in small towns, not through the internet, not through advertising, but through kitchens and church halls and the checkout line at the gas station. Miller's got tomatoes. Miller's got peppers. Have you been to that stand on 14? The stuff tastes like it used to taste. By the second week of August, I was setting up the stand at 6:30 and selling out by 10. Karen started helping, bringing out baked goods, zucchini bread, tomato basil focaccia, jalapeno cornbread, and those sold out even faster than the vegetables. People came from Greenville, from Harrisburg, from as far as Marion. They came in pickups and sedans and minivans with car seats in the back. They came because the grocery store shelves were bare and the prices were high, and they needed to feed their families something real. But they kept coming, even after the stores started restocking, even after the supply chains stitched themselves back together. Because what they found at the stand was something the stores couldn't offer. They found food that had been picked that morning. They found tomatoes that were still warm from the sun. They found a farmer who could tell them exactly which row their beans came from and how many days their corn had been on the stalk. They found a man in a Carhartt jacket and mud-caked boots who remembered their names and asked about their kids and set aside a bag of sun golds for the little girl who came every Tuesday with her grandmother. Her name was Lily. She was 7. She called me Mr. Tomato. I let her. The money wasn't life-changing, not at first. That first summer, the stand brought in just under $11,000. That's not nothing. It covered the electric bill for months and put gas in the truck. But it wasn't going to save a 600-acre farm. But something else was happening. Something I hadn't expected. People started asking me what I was going to grow next year. They started placing orders in advance. Save me a flat of Brandywines in July. A woman from Harrisburg, who ran a small restaurant, asked if I could supply her with heirloom tomatoes and fresh herbs every week during the summer. A man who managed the kitchen at the county hospital asked about bulk pricing on peppers and sweet corn. I sat at the kitchen table one night in September, after the last tomatoes had been picked, and the first frost was just a week or two away, and I did the math again. Not the old math, the row crop math, the diesel and debt math that had been suffocating me for years. New math, garden math. If I expanded the market garden from 2 acres to 5, which I could do because I had the land, and I had the water, and I now had the soil knowledge, and if I added winter crops in a simple high tunnel, and if I kept the restaurant account and added 2 or 3 more, and if the roadside stand kept growing the way it had been growing. The numbers worked. Not lavishly. Not the way the Henderson operation worked, with its GPS combines and its government subsidies and its economies of scale, but quietly, steadily, honestly. The numbers worked. Karen looked at the notebook over my shoulder. She didn't say anything for a long time. "Your mother would be proud," she finally said. My throat closed up. I nodded and kept writing. I still farm row crops. I kept 200 of the 600 acres, the best ground, the fields closest to the well, and I leased the rest to the Pulaskis, who were happy to have it. The income from the lease covers the mortgage. The market garden covers everything else. It's not glamorous. I wake up at 5 and I'm in the garden by 5:30, picking whatever came ripe overnight. The tomatoes need suckering, and the beans need picking, and the corn needs checking, and there's always something that needs watering or weeding or staking or mending. My hands are still cracked. My back still aches. I still smell like soil and sweat at the end of every day. But the debt is shrinking. The fuel bill is manageable because you don't need a 200 horsepower tractor to tend 2 acres of tomatoes. You need a wheelbarrow and a strong back. The equipment that used to drain me is parked more often than it runs, and when it does run, it runs on my schedule, not on the schedule of a commodity market that doesn't know my name. The stand is bigger now. I built a proper structure last fall. Cedar posts, a tin roof that doesn't leak, wooden shelves that Karen stained and sealed. There's a chalkboard sign out front that she updates every morning with what's available. On Saturdays in July, there's a line before we open. Lily still comes every Tuesday. She's 9 now. She helps me sort the sun golds into pint containers, and she's very serious about making sure each one is perfect. Her grandmother told me once, quietly, while Lily was arranging tomatoes, that the little girl wants to be a farmer when she grows up. She says she wants to grow things that make people happy, her grandmother said. I had to turn away for a moment. The morning light was coming through the trees at the edge of the property, golden and warm, and the air smelled like ripe tomatoes and cut grass and something else. Something I couldn't name but that I recognized from a long time ago, from summer mornings when I was small and my mother was in the garden and the world felt simple and good and enough. Dale Henderson stopped by the stand last August. I hadn't spoken to him since that day at the co-op when he'd laughed about me growing vegetables. He pulled up in his big white pickup and walked over with his hands in his pockets and looked at the rows of tomatoes and peppers and basil lined up on the shelves and didn't say anything for a while. "How much for a bag of those Brandywines?" he finally asked. $4 a pound. He nodded, picked out 6 tomatoes, big ones, the kind with the deep ridges and the dark shoulders, handed me a 20 and told me to keep the change. "Karen's tomatoes remind me of my grandmother's," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, something soft, something almost like envy. "They're not Karen's," I said. "They're my mother's, same seeds, same soil." He stood there for another moment, looking out past the barn toward the garden rows. The sun was low, and the light was catching the tomato plants in a way that turned their leaves almost gold. A breeze came through, carrying the smell of warm earth and basil, and I could see Dale breathe it in. This man who farmed 3,000 acres with satellite-guided machinery, standing in front of my 2-acre garden and breathing in the smell like it was something he'd lost a long time ago and hadn't expected to find again. My grandmother used to sell corn from a stand like this, he said quietly. Over on Route 37. Before my dad scaled everything up. I didn't know that. In 20 years of living 5 miles from the Hendersons, I'd never heard that story. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, like he understood something he hadn't expected to understand, and he got back in his truck and drove away. I watched him go, and I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired and grateful and strangely at peace. The way you feel when you've been fighting something for a very long time, and you finally realize you don't have to fight it anymore because you've already found another way. 2 weeks later, Dale's wife started coming to the stand every Saturday. She never mentioned Dale's visit, and I never brought it up. She just bought her tomatoes, complimented the basil, and asked Karen for the focaccia recipe. Some things don't need to be spoken. They just settle into place, quietly, like seeds finding the right depth in the soil. My father told me once that the secret to farming isn't in the size of your harvest. He said it on a November evening, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with the fields bare and brown around us, and I was 17, and I didn't understand. The secret, he said, is knowing what to grow. I thought he meant corn or soybeans. I thought he was talking about crop rotation, about markets, about timing. But he wasn't. He was talking about something else entirely. He was talking about attention, about standing in a garden at dawn and listening, really listening, to what the land is trying to tell you and what the people around you actually need. For 24 years, I grew what the market told me to grow. I grew volume. I grew bushels. I grew numbers on a spreadsheet that someone in a trading office in Chicago would glance at and forget. And it nearly broke me. Then I grew tomatoes, and it saved everything, not the money. Though the money matters, and it comes, and it's enough. What saved me was the look on a stranger's face when she bit into a Cherokee Purple for the first time. What saved me was Lily's small hands arranging sun-golds like jewels. What saved me was the line of cars on a Saturday morning, people who drove 20 miles for something they couldn't find at the grocery store. Not just food, but trust, connection. The knowledge that the hands that grew this also handed it to you. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 46 years old. I farm a small piece of ground behind a big red barn in central Illinois, and I finally understand what my father meant. The secret isn't in the size of your harvest. The secret is in knowing exactly what people need and having the courage to grow it.